Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Ash. I'm an economist and researcher at the UCLA Anderson Forecast. This is the latest edition of our podcast, whose aim is to connect some of the interesting research that's being done in the academic community with a broader audience. Today, I'm very excited to welcome a researcher whose work I admire a lot, Professor Tony Cookson. He's a professor of finance at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Tony has a very interesting growing body of work on social media and finance, which is a growing area. Obviously, social media itself is somewhat new, but social media has obviously exploded in interest, and the academic research is kind of catching up and growing week by week. And so another exciting aspect of that, Tony, is that you have a wonderful literature review out in the Oxford Research Encyclopedias, which kind of reviews this kind of new burgeoning literature. So that might be of interest to people. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about today, and as well as some new work that I know you've been doing on market-wide signals from social media. So thanks for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was always excited to talk about my research.
Great. Okay, so I thought a good place to start would just be on the what brought you into social media research. And obviously, this is a kind of very broad area, but what are some of the important aspects of to you and what brought you to this line of research?
It is an interesting question. I wasn't initially attracted to social media research because of social media. I actually viewed it as a nice opportunity to see things that were helpful for testing finance theories. So my co-author, Marina Niesner, and I were looking to construct a measure of disagreement that was a higher frequency measure of disagreement. And we looked all over the place and we found this investor social media platform. It was really small at the time. This is probably about 10 years ago, in about 2015. This was called StockTwits. And what we noticed is that people were actually saying that they were bullish and bearish about a whole wide cross section of stocks. And we thought, well, isn't that a great opportunity to measure disagreement? And so we sort of developed a paper out of that and eventually published it. But it was such a rich environment where we could see things that led us to sort of write several papers. And then GameStop happened. And I think that sort of changed the profession's attitude toward how important social media research was. And we just kind of happened to be there working on investor social media and having papers that spoke to the phenomenon as it was happening. So partly it was intention, but partly it was accident. And because we had sort of studied the details of these platforms for a while, we were in a good position to continue that research, and it gets more exciting every day.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely excellent timing. And yes, it does seem that the GameStop episode and also some of the episodes of Bitcoin kind of catalyzed some of the interest in this stuff, which is great. So I guess, I mean, we'll come onto that, some of the things you just mentioned there in a little while, especially social media as a lens to understand kind of behavior in general, which, as you say, is kind of a starting point for you getting into this. But I thought first it would be a good idea just to kind of introduce us to the world of kind of social media, which I guess is a bit different from the universe of social media at large. You've probably maybe been astounded in the same way as I have, just how many social media there are. And from year to year, it seems like there's new ones. I guess now Blue Sky is maybe the new kid on the block. And I don't know if there's a Blue Sky Finance yet, but I assume there will be one eventually, and we'll be studying it. So can you maybe introduce us to kind of the world of finance social media? Which ones does it kind of consist of, and which ones do you think are important for different types of investor?
Yeah, I think with academic research, a lot of times it's backward looking. And so over the past decade, the sort of three big players in investor social media are StockTwits, Twitter, and Seeking Alpha. And you might think, well, Seeking Alpha is kind of like where people write these longer form posts, but there's a lot of interaction in the comments. And that's kind of how we sort of view it as kind of social media. Like it's sort of generally a media that has kind of interaction following, sharing, kind of all of those aspects. So that's kind of what's distinctive. And I think what's distinctive from sort of the broader social media ecosystem. So you think of like Twitter, where people are talking about political issues, or they're talking about how do you do a startup and all this. Well, Twitter has a bunch of different sub communities. The sub community for that's relevant for finance is what's called FinTwit, and they talk about individual stocks and their recommendations. And actually, relative to other social media, finance social media tends to be actually way more optimistic. So this is actually, I think, something that surprises people when you actually look at the composition of posts that people author on these websites. 80% of them tend to be bullish across platforms. Like, so it's actually kind of an unbridledly optimistic place where people tend to follow things that they're like and that they're fanatics about, right? And so I think it's sort of a different kind of ecosystem in that like people are sharing enthusiasm as well as sharing information. I think that sort of leads to kind of an interesting tension between, well, if people are getting information from this, and that information wasn't fully information in the first place, it was enthusiasm. What does that actually mean for the information environment surrounding firms, surrounding stocks? And I think it raises a lot of questions, like how much is information and how much is so this sort of enthusiasm.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think, I read in your review, you mentioned that um, traditional news tends to be quite negative, actually. So it's almost the flip side. And there, I mean, I think you sort of hypothesized that some aspect of that might be that people go to news for news, whereas people perhaps go to social media to be like excited or informed in that sort of way. So it's a sort of different usage in some sense.
Absolutely. And actually, one other aspect of investor social media is that it tends to be a lot broader in its coverage. So, traditional news, you'll see like the FANG stocks, so Facebook, Amazon, Apple, et cetera. And you can see that like those stocks are covered all the time in the newspaper. And every once in a while, you'll get like a small firm that's covered in the Wall Street Journal, but that's really big news for that small firm. By contrast, we could see actually pretty consistent coverage on StockTwits across the size spectrum of firms. It's not just the big stocks, but the big stocks are talked about a lot. But it's also the small stocks. And actually, the mid-sized stocks are the ones that are really actually underrepresented, is that you tend to see kind of this U-shaped pattern of attention where like there's a lot of attention to sort of very small stocks, and there's sort of these communities that form around these small stocks, which is kind of an interesting ecosystem to study.
Yeah, it's an interesting difference, as you say, from what exists in traditional media. And I guess on that note, so as you mentioned, there's to some degree some overlap between social media and traditional media, but there's also quite specific differences. So I know you have one paper which I find fascinating. It's your news consumption in the wild paper, where you managed to get hold of this Australian Financial Review. It's a big
Right.
finance
Yeah.
press entity in Australia. So, I mean, in light of that, and also other parts of the literature, are there other things about the differences between social media and traditional media that stick out?
Yeah, I think like partly it's the coverage, partly it's also like how rational the attention is. So I think when you think about like you mentioned my news consumption in the Wild paper, I mean that's purely a paper about traditional media attention and like what news articles people are paying attention to. One of the things that we see is that in that one is that when the broad market goes down, you see a lot more attention to the front page and to macro type news. You actually see that it siphons off attention from firm specific news. So that people actually do pay attention to the news of the day. If that something big is going on in the macro economy, even if you care about a specific firm's outcomes and you're an investor in that, you probably want to pay attention to the macroeconomy. And so, like, what we find in that paper is actually a pretty rational attention to like what types of news should you read. And we actually see the page views that people have on the Australian Financial Review, which is a great place to look for if Australian market signals seem where are people going to be directing their attention. It's going to be in the Australian Financial Review. And so we think that's kind of an interesting contrast to my research on social media. Whereas, like in some of my work on social media, like people direct attention toward uh, like users that they're following who share like-minded beliefs. So I have a paper about echo chambers. We published at the Review of Financial Studies. What we showed there was actually people follow others who not just tweet about the same stocks, but tweet with the same sentiment about the same stocks. And so we see that actually, like, what's kind of different about social media versus traditional media is that you sort of see this more enthusiasm, fanaticism element driving a lot of the attention that people are paying. And to the extent that this relates to actual trading decisions, we connect some of the measures we have on social media to trading. We think that's rather important because if you're directing your attention in ways that are confirmation biased, that doesn't necessarily get information into markets. And it could lead to volatility, more trading that doesn't really have much to do with fundamentals. So that's it is an aspect of social media that's I think kind of important, and some of my research speaks to that aspect as well.
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned obviously there's this sort of substitutability almost between the kind of broader information and firm specific information. People perhaps only have a fixed amount of time to consume either. I was interested too in that paper how you mentioned the importance, because you're able to track people's reading habits. You mentioned that people would perhaps see new emerging news about a firm or some element of the macro environment, and then they would go back to old information, what you guys referred to as stale news, I think. And I guess
Right.
that contrasts with what you mentioned about social media and echo chambers, where instead of perhaps going through that sort of, linear time kind of path, people instead go into echo chambers and kind of just feed around in there until there's more and more fanaticism.
Right. That's a really interesting contrast. Like when we looked at how do people consume firm specific news, and we can very precisely know that the news is firm specific because we can see that the article was linking to basically a ticker page. And so we could tell that the article is about that firm, and like people actually associated with it because we could see people actually going from that article to that ticker page. What we saw was that actually articles that were posted like several days ago or several weeks ago, when like the firm had like a lot going on, people would actually go revisit those articles. And it's sort of, again, that sort of reinforces like how rational like news reading on something like Wall Street Journal or Australian Financial Review or Financial Times is that people read the news of the day. And if they're really interested in it, they're going to read other articles that are related to that, and that's something that we found actually direct evidence of in our news consumption in the wild paper, which was I thought was kind of cool. Is it an interesting contrast just how rational traditional news reading is versus engagement on social media?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Um, so, I mean, I guess in some sense that's, social media versus traditional media. Um, so you also, in your review paper, you kind of create this useful sort of framework for thinking about social media where you separate social media as a lens to observe behavior that it was already happening perhaps versus the actual effects of social media itself, because social media has become such an important entity. It's perhaps driving things in new ways in different directions. And so I was wondering if you, would comment on that, the connections between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is one thing that our review does is it provides an organization of the literature into these two categories or modes of research. The research I mentioned about disagreement, we didn't necessarily think that social media was driving the disagreement. We sort of felt that it reflected the disagreement, and we thought it was useful insofar as like that measure was a useful higher frequency measure of disagreement. Same thing with like measuring sentiment or attention. Sometimes it's just a reflection of what we think is kind of underlying people's attention processes or their sentiment. And social media, because it's such like we spend so much time on it, and the people who are on there spend a large fraction of their time on these platforms. Uh, to the extent that our content is contributed there, a lot of the research that we saw initially into social media was, what does this reflect about us? What does this say about us? So one example that's not my research that is in this vein of like social media as a lens is the Facebook data. So Johannes Strobel and Teresa Kuchler and co-authors who've done these studies sort of looking at social connectedness using Facebook connections, they were actually able to sort of use this as a way to say, well, how are we connected in ways offline, right? And so there's they've sort of followed this up with research on social capital and how people are connected across classes, and all of this actually reveals deep fundamental insights into our social interactions and how that relates to our economic life. And it doesn't necessarily per se say anything about like how does social media influence our lives. But I think it's still quite foundational, and social media provides us with that opportunity to see things that we wouldn't see otherwise. And I think like especially for people who've come to social media after seeing events like GameStop or SVB and seeing that like it really did seem to have some effects there, and it'd be nice to know, well, what were those effects? I think this is actually a novel perspective to say, like, look, that type of social media research, it is social media research, but it's different in terms of its aims. It's different in terms of its goals. It's different in terms of like what would threaten your validity. I think what you need to do in that type of research is you need to say, well, does this like actually reflect like the overall social fabric that you're trying to measure? Like in our case, when we were measuring disagreement, does this actually reflect disagreement of investors we might care about? And so we have had to do a set of tests to say, okay, well, how does this relate to sort of the types of trading that people do and different types of trading and so on? And so like that was something that we'd have to do. By contrast, like the other aspect, looking at the effects of social media is actually very challenging research because if you want to say that social media had an effect rather than just reflecting something about the people who contributed that information, that's a challenging thing to do, and it requires a lot of sort of careful econometrics to sort of get down to that point. Right? And so there's some really interesting research by say Karsten Mueller, who has sort of looked at this South by Southwest festival that advertised Twitter in its early days. And it turns out that like persistently, this has created like geographic clusters of Twitter usage that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And he's been able to show things like social media has kind of led to sort of more hate speech in certain areas, and he has a new paper that I quite like that looks at the consequences for stock market participation. And so he's able to actually make causal statements out of that. You can see that's pretty challenging. That was creative to come up with such an instrument, but like, I think the aims are different to show that social media has effects. It most certainly does. I mean, I think days after SVB, I think we learned that like social media was responsible for a lot of the disruption that we saw. During GameStop, we could see that like there was something different about like how people were coming together and banding together. And so like I think, but the standards of academic research are kind of much higher, and that's I think where sort of being careful and creative about how you approach those questions comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's obviously an important distinction, and you're right, it's a very difficult challenge, certainly a challenge that I've struggled with myself, trying to identify the effects of social media. So that is a really important distinction, and I think it's a very useful kind of tool to understand different parts of the literature on social media. Another important distinction is kind of the difference between, sort of more micro-specific signals in social media that are associated with individual firms or stocks versus the kind of market-wide signal, if you like.
Mhm.
I know this is something that you have more recent research and a recent working paper on. So can you tell us something about the difference between kind of the firm level, sentiment, attention associated with social media versus, the kind of more market-wide impact?
Yeah, this is something that we're currently still digging into. I mean, you mentioned a recent working paper. It's a preliminary draft at this point, hopefully to be posted online soon, where we're looking at market-wide signals from social media. And what we mean by signals here is we're looking at like how does attention and sentiment so relate to kind of outcome, like how do like attention and sentiment that you draw from social media relate to say prices, for example. So um, I should kind of go back and say the starting point of this was that we had written a separate paper called The Social Signal, which was published last year at the Journal of Financial Economics, where we studied kind of the differences across platforms in sentiment and attention. And one of the things that we saw is that actually, by and large, sentiment is pretty different across platforms, and attention is pretty similar. So these platforms are paying attention to the same thing, but they kind of disagree about like how the prospects of individual firms. So when we looked at the sentiment and attention there in that paper, one of the things that we looked at later was actually like how do they differ with respect to predicting returns and so on. And one of the things we saw at the firm level was that sentiment tended to predict positive returns after like a spike in sentiment. And it was mild. It wasn't like a huge effect. I'm not sure that I'm not offering trading advice here, but like there seemed to be actually after positive sentiment on a given day, there'd be a little bit sort of like a kind of a persistent higher return for like the next 20 days, over the next 20 days. Whereas attention was actually quite different at the firm level. Firm level, we actually saw like a pretty stark reversal in, and that was actually something that was pretty like it sort of made sense with respect to like a lot of the research on attention on from other sources. Like if you looked at like attention from the Google search volume index, you would see this pretty striking reversal as well. And so like we thought it was interesting that like on social media you could measure sentiment and attention differently, and you saw these divergent connections to future returns. What we discovered and why we're writing a new paper is that when you look at this at the macro level, you basically aggregate the part of the sentiment that isn't firm specific up to the market level, just sort of see, okay, here's an aggregate sentiment for today. When that measure is high, it actually reflects a reversal. So remember, sentiment at the firm level was like a continuation. There was sort of a lot of return coincident with high sentiment, and it continued a bit, and it didn't reverse. But at the macro level, it's actually looks like animal spirits, as you would think of like sentiment and in general. And so like there actually seems to be like a pretty big contrast between like the macro level sentiment versus the firm specific. And also it's sort of interesting, like attention is the opposite as well, is that attention seems to reflect a continuation. It predicts less return going forward, but like it's like you see more attention on days after there was high volatility or low returns. So you actually see kind of this sort of again divergent reactions between sentiment and attention, but they're different than at the micro level. So I think there may be some kind of interesting opportunities to sort of think about market wide signals and sort of what this means for sort of the broad indexes as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously the market-wide impact is very broadly important. And you mentioned this is obviously early days, and this is kind of something you're investigating with the data. But do you have some sense of why that difference exists? Is it
Yeah,
different people, like different investors, looking at those different different kind of market.
So, so these are the same posts that underlie this. But like the way to think about this is that the way you get high sentiment in a market-wide sense is that sentiment is high across many stocks.
Mhm.
That's the only way that you can get that. And the same thing for attention is that attention is high across many stocks. That in that sense, it's not about a particular firm's prospects or excitement about a particular firm. And so as a result, like when you think of like sentiment is high around like 500 different stocks, and that's why you see high sentiment, that's a pretty different interpretation of what sentiment is than if sentiment was high around one particular stock. If sentiment clusters around one stock, well, that there's probably a reason for that. If sentiment is high around everything, that reason is more like the sentiment that Keynes was talking about. So I think that's actually what's distinctive about adding it up across many stocks. Same thing with attention. If everyone is paying abnormal attention to the stocks on in the macro, like across many different tickers, well, that's suggests problems. That there's something that's making people nervous, and that there's a big, broad conversation that's not just happening about sort of an individual stock, and so that's sort of reflects problems as well. So one of the things we do in the paper is we look at both like the returns that follow high sentiment and attention, and we also look at like what sort of drives sentiment and attention. The kind of interesting thing is that sentiment tends to be more related to recent returns, um, and attention tends to be more related to like recent trading. And so it's kind of like there really are distinct sort of ideas what drives each of these things, and we're sort of using social media as a lens to tell us, well, what's actually happening in terms of like the broad notion of sentiment and intention. We think I think that's kind of I'm excited to pursue it further because I think there are a lot of different nuances we can get into with that.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, as you say, that one links more to returns and one links more to kind of trading volume or the actual number of trades that are happening. It's a really
Okay.
interesting difference. And I guess one thing that this sparks to my mind is some of your previous work at the firm level has identified the importance of events. And so I think, for example, you've talked about how the GameStop bubble kind of changed the social signal, if you like, perhaps became less informative since GameStop. And do you think that's also true at the market-wide level? Like, again, I know that this is kind of
No, it's an interesting contrast between firm specific and market. We actually have looked into like, is it like macro news events that's driving these things? One of the things we looked into was in the macro signal project that we're working on is like we've looked at major movements in the market, jumps. The market goes up by 2% versus down by 2%. One of the things that we thought was actually pretty striking in that market-wide signal paper was that the positive jumps see no reaction to sentiment or attention. Like neither one seems responsive. It's like sentiment is pretty flat before, it's flat after, and there's like nothing happening on like the day when it goes up by 2%. The broad market does. By contrast, negative jumps are really important for both attention and sentiment. Attention is higher, coincident with a negative jump, and sentiment is lower and stays low for 2 or 3 days. So what's kind of interesting about this is that you might have thought that returns predicting sentiment that felt like an extrapolative process, and there are these sort of models of extrapolation and bubbles, and that you might think, oh, well, this might be a really good opportunity to see extrapolation and bubbles to support bubbles, but like you need to actually have the extrapolation happen on the upside. And what we're seeing is it's actually kind of on the downside. Is that we see sentiment is extrapolative. It depends on previous returns, but it depends on negative movements in previous returns, not so much positive ones. And so we thought that was actually pretty. I think that'll be a pretty key insight from this research as we develop it further and try to understand what's driving that.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. As you mentioned, like when I thought previously about extrapolation, usually it's thinking about the positive side, whereas it might actually be the opposite. Um, okay, so one last question I just wanted to touch on because I think it's interesting to kind of people outside of academia too is, are there things that about the social media environment we've mentioned that there may be changes that have happened because of social media? And so, are there things that investors should be kind of careful of when participating in this new world of sort of social media finance? And similarly for, maybe a harder question for policymakers, are there things that are worth, considering for those types of people?
Yeah, one aspect that I've actually found very difficult from a researcher standpoint is to try to get into this idea of misinformation.
Mm.
I think that is like it's certainly in the broader social media ecosystem. It's a major topic, right? And so you sort of think about like biases and misinformation. I've studied a bit biases when thinking about my echo chambers paper, where people sort of follow people who are like-minded. That tends to lead to kind of less information updating than you would in a usual information environment. I think for investors, that's something to watch out for. The thing that we couldn't get a handle on as much, but my co-author Marina has some work on this, is sort of this idea of fake news, that where people put out deliberately false information, and like what are the consequences of that? I think this is actually particularly pernicious in financial markets because fake news degrades not just the quality of the signal for the fake information that's out there, but to the extent that it's masquerading as actual news, and people know that there is the possibility that it's not true. They're not going to put as much weight on it, and the information doesn't get impounded into prices as readily, right? And so people kind of underreact to this. I think that's something that I kind of worry about in terms of like what are the consequences of misinformation. It's not so much that people don't pay attention to fake stuff; it's that they don't pay attention to genuine information and sort of leave money on the table because of that. I mean, certainly from an investor, you don't want to follow some fake news, but like it is an environment where information isn't always verifiable, and with it not being as verifiable, you might see people react less to it. So sort of naturally, I think like from a policy perspective, like there is concern about like, well, what types of information can be posted on social media and by insiders and this, and certainly the SEC I'm sure aware of these types of issues. I'm not like raising anything that they haven't thought about. Certainly the SEC has thought about social media for quite some time when they sort of allowed social media like firms to disclose their information coincident with their 8Ks on social media, right? So like they've been able to do that for like a decade. So this is this is part of the information environment, and with it being part of the information environment, it sort of raises some of these classic questions of is that information true? Is it material? And so on. And I think that those classic questions just in a more complicated and messier information environment where not everything is true or verifiable. And the more we pay attention to things like social media, when we get our news to act on it in like an investor context, um, the less rational it's gonna sort of feel, and that doesn't feel uh, as concrete in terms of like the classic asset pricing attention models that we think would lead to more efficient markets.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially as you say, thinking of it as being more about there being a degradation in the available good quality news versus people necessarily being kind of misled by the news that they see. I think that's kind of an important is an interesting distinction. And I think you mentioned too in your review article, there's a there's maybe some optimism, which is I think there's a paper that found that after certain instances or after a certain SEC investigation, there was kind of a more investors were more likely to be skeptical of the information they were seeing versus kind of following it. And so it
Right.
seems like there is some potential for the literature to identify some things, but it's going to be tough work, obviously.
Right. And this was the paper by my co-author, Marina.
Right.
Yeah. So they were sort of looking at these SEC, like these sort of known to be fake articles on Seeking Alpha. And they used that to sort of train a model to say, well, what articles look more like this afterwards? And this is kind of the basis of what I'm saying about this is that there is some evidence that people place less trust in information that looks like information that was fake.
Yeah.
And so like to the extent that like fake news is or false information sort of looks more like the genuine information, that's that is a concern because well, like and I view that as a concerning result is that I think it's very natural that people would place less value in that. But I think like from like a policymaker standpoint, finding a way so that like we don't see as much of that fake news or it's easier to identify or easier to flag, that would improve the efficiency of the information.
Yeah. Great. Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. So that's all we have time for, unfortunately. Although I'm sure we could talk about this for much longer. But so thanks very much for talking to us. For anyone listening that wants to look into this area of research more, I definitely encourage people to look at the great social media and finance review article Professor Cookson has in the Oxford Research Encyclopedias. I think it's also available on your website. I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we have links to everything on my website. So that's you can find any of the papers I mentioned through that.
Right. So perfect. Thank you very much again. This has been an Anderson Forecast podcast. And so thanks everyone for listening. And thank you again, Professor Cookson, for sharing all your insight and knowledge.
Great. Thanks for having me.